I'm Akinyele Umoja. I grew up in the West Coast. Compton, California is where I spent most of my elementary and teenage years, a few other places, but that's primarily where I grew up, in Compton. My father is actually from this county. He was born in this county. My father was a sharecropper until he was close to 30 years old. And then he went to an adult Christian program that had a high school in Nashville, Tennessee. It was called Nashville Christian Institute. And he was able, in his early 30s, to get a high school diploma. And he became one of the first black people to go to Pepperdine College in California. And that's where he met my mother, who was from Oklahoma. Her family was from northern Louisiana. But my father was actually born in Bolivar County, a place called Alligator, which is in the northern part of this county. But going back to myself, graduated from high school, I became involved in activism in the Los Angeles area. And I recently wrote a book called We Will Shoot Back that looks at armed self-defense in Mississippi. And I'll tell you how I got to that. But how I got to this story was I was, as an activist, and particularly as a student activist, I was a part of a group called the National Black Student Association. It was a group that existed in the 70s. It's not a lot written about this group or anything of that nature. Some of the elders we had for our group were people like Ella Baker. Y'all heard of Ella Baker? Who was the mentor to people who were in Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This the group I was in started in the mid-70s, around 1976. We also had, if you ever heard of Queen Mother Moore? Queen Mother Moore is sometimes called the mother of the reparations movement. She was a part of the Garvey movement when she was a young woman in Louisiana. Then she moves to New York. She becomes a part of the Communist Party. Then she got on this whole idea about reparations for black people, and she was the one who promoted that. We had elders like that for our group. One of the elders was a woman by the name of Virginia Collins and her son Walter Collins. Virginia Collins was a black nationalist. She also went by the name of Dara Bubakari. If you see the book Black Women in White America by Gilda Lerner, she's interviewed in that book. But she was one of our elders. We had a meeting in Atlanta in 1976, and I got a ride back to New Orleans because I'd never been there with Walter Collins and Virginia Collins, and they start telling me stories about black people defending themselves when we were driving from Atlanta to Louisiana, particularly when we got close to Birmingham. And I'd never heard these stories before. It's interesting to me because as we just had the 50th anniversary of the girls being bombed in the church in Birmingham, you heard Condoleezza Rice and Angela Davis, two people on two different political spectrums, talk about how their fathers both participated in armed patrols of the black community after some of the bombings. But they told me stories about black people having guns and burying weapons in the country so they could keep them there in case people tried to disarm them, and things I'd never heard of before. And then they began to tell me story after story about people in the South protecting and defending themselves. And growing up in California, I never heard of that. In fact, in California, I grew up during a period of time of the Black Panthers, groups like that. I was very much inspired by Malcolm X. I didn't know anything like that existed in the South. So it became something I always wanted to get more information on. Fast forward, I moved to Georgia and decided to go to graduate school. And I went, had the opportunity to go to Emory University and got my master's and PhD there. I think my second semester, I was I took a class on Southern Studies, and I thought I wanted to pursue this idea of armed self-defense in the South. And my professor, Alan Tullis, said, that'd be a great dissertation topic. And I took it around with it. And so it became a dissertation topic. And after I finished my dissertation in 1996, put it to the side for a minute, and because the department I was in at that time wanted me to get tenure through journal articles, and that's what I did. But I worked on the book. I constantly came back here, did interviews. I met people like Margaret Block, who I didn't meet at first, and that really enhanced my work. But it just took a lot of time, interviews, because again, since a lot of these stories weren't up front and center in most of the civil rights scholarship before my dissertation, I would argue, because you didn't see a lot. Then after my dissertation came out, you saw Timothy Tyson's book on Robert Williams. You saw, y'all heard of Robert Williams? Everybody here, you heard of Robert Williams? Robert Williams was a black man, North Carolina. In 1957, his community had Klansmen would come there with regularity and harass people, and he decided he was going to put an end to it. So he organized. He was head of the NAACP in his town. He organized something called the Black Guard. So when the Klansmen came in, they would repel them. And after they did it the first time, actually, Klansmen didn't come back for a long period of time. And then you had Lance Hill, who wrote a book called The Deacons for Defense. And the Deacons for Defense started in Louisiana. Again, you had a community in northern Louisiana called Jonesboro. And in that community, Klansmen would come through, again, with regularity and harass people. And particularly when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Klan intensified the type of harassment they would have on black folk, and also the Congress of Racial Equality that was organizing in their community. And so several 14 black people came together. 12 of them had military experience from either Korean War or World War II. And they took an inventory of weapons they had in the community, ammunition they had in the community, and they formed an armed patrol. And again, after they did that, they kind of stopped the Klan from coming in their community. I think the precipitating incident was the Klan came through their community to harass them, and they had a police escort to harass them. So that was a clear message. We don't have any police support. And so if we can't rely on the police, we have to rely upon ourselves. The cavalry's not coming for us, right? And when I say the cavalry's not coming, since I'm in Atlanta, I again have the privilege of having access to the records of the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which are in the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. They're in their archives. And so I look at all these requests of both these organizations when they're in Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Georgia for police protection and, from federal protection, Justice Department protection, and it rarely comes. So again, a lot of people had to make the decision, look, we got to protect our families, we got to protect our lives, we got to protect these people we've asked to come from around the country to help us register people to vote. And so I saw that from place to place to place. The SNCC people were SNCC people and core people and local NAACP people were taking these measures. Ultimately, I argue that some of these nonviolent organizations kind of changed their policy because they were dependent upon these local people. And so, for instance, most of you met Hollis Watkins. Am I correct? Hollis Watkins? Well, Hollis Watkins was from Pike County. He was the first person to join the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in this state. So y'all definitely need to talk to him. Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes, who's now Curtis Muhammad. They were the first two people. I think Curtis was from Bogachita, but y'all definitely need to talk to them. They were young people who were involved in the first sit-in in Macomb, you know. So, but even though they participated in nonviolent activity, Hollis, when he went to Holmes County, he felt that he needed to participate in the armed patrol of protecting the community too. So even though he was in a nonviolent organization, he decided, look, these people I'm staying with, you know, who provide me security, who provide me food, provide me a vehicle to use in the day, provide me gas, because you know SNCC people didn't get paid that much money, right? If they really got it, if they got paid at all. What was the amount? It was something like it was like $10 a week, or it was something scandalous that you wouldn't work for today unless you were really just committed or you crazy, right? And so but he said if people were going out to protect him, he had to protect them, help protect the community too. But ultimately, these organizations, through that process, CORE and SNCC, particularly, they began to embrace self-defense also. It kind of transformed that part of the movement. So that's what my book looks at. It looks a part of that. There's some other things that's in there too, but I don't want to belabor the point. So I took the time to do this research. One of the things I argued last night is one of the reasons we don't know about this is the movement in the South, with the exception, but particularly from the 50s all the way through like 64, 65, 66, really didn't talk about the self-defense aspect, with the exception of Robert Williams, who I told you in North Carolina. Everybody else, even when they weren't nonviolent, used the banner of nonviolence. Why do you think that? Because their theory was, or their thought was, that they were going to get support from the president, they were going to get support from the Congress, they were going to get support from the Democratic Party, and if they wanted support from Northern whites, even to Northern whites, the thought of black men with guns scares the hell out of them. And so they didn't want to project that image, right? So they projected an image of nonviolence. There were some people, that's what I call tactical nonviolence. It's different from philosophical nonviolence. What I mean by philosophical nonviolence, the philosophical nonviolence believes that if you're nonviolent and a violent perpetrator is attacking you, ultimately that violent perpetrator will be so horrified by what they're doing that ultimately it will transform them, and then you could have some form of reconciliation. And some people believe that was going to happen, and you would have what they call the beloved community would emerge from that, right? Some people didn't necessarily believe that. They just said, look, we need support from the North, and it's not going to happen if we're out here with guns. And that was one thing that was debated all the time in the movement too. How far should they go? And I think the first time in SNCC you had a debate is in 1964 on the eve of Freedom Summer. They had a debate in Atlanta because the SNCC chapter in Greenwood had armed their office. They actually had guns there, and they had a whole debate about what they were going to do. Why did they arm the office? Because what was to the movement, I'm going to ask y'all this question. How did the movement get its intelligence? What was this CIA? What was the CIA for the movement? The black domestics. Black domestics were the intelligence force. And so some of the black domestics got information through a list. They found a death list of people in the movement that were supposed to be killed. Amzie Moore was supposed to be killed. Bob Moses was supposed to be killed. You know, so there was a list of people on the eve of Freedom Summer who were supposed to be offed, who were supposed to be taken out by white supremacists. And when people got this list, they said they had to form self-defense groups. There actually was a meeting in Amzie Moore's house right before Freedom Summer discussing the need to have a black self-defense network throughout the state. Y'all from Macomb, after the bombing of the Freedom House in Macomb, people in Macomb's community formed self-defense groups. to protect the Freedom House. Now, some people, like y'all know, you ever talk to Jesse Harris? Jesse Harris lives in Jackson today. He was the leader of the Freedom House, or the COFO group in Macomb after Freedom Summer. And he said he was nonviolent. He couldn't do it because he was a part of SNCC. But he said, but I can't say nothing about the people in the community to come protect us. Because many SNCC people took that policy, is they couldn't, some of them said they couldn't carry arms, but if people in the community decided to protect them and they had to support what they said, they were supporting grassroots leadership, right? Then you couldn't really argue with that. I think when Bob Moses first came to Mississippi, he did try to argue with Mr. E.W. Steptoe, who was y'all heard of his name? Mm-hmm. He was in Mid-County, right? Yeah. And he did argue with him back and forth, but they said Mr. Steptoe stopped arguing with him. He just carried his guns anyway. But I talked enough. I don't like to talk a long time, so. Well, that's a lie. I do like to talk a long time, but that's not the most effective thing. So, y'all have any thoughts or questions?
How did you come across the list, like the death list?
I didn't come across it.
Or how?
Again, if you got a domestic, a lot of times, black, and y'all just saw if you've seen The Butler, a lot of times domestics weren't thought to be threatening. And they thought, well, Miss Sally works for me. She loyal to me, you know. And so they might not be conscious. Oh, Miss Sally said we gotta hide this list, you know. But so sometimes the security precautions weren't taken. Sometimes people would hear conversations, things of that nature, because they weren't thought to be threatening. Maybe they were thought to be members of the family. Because of the whole concept of paternalism. So sometimes they wouldn't think that Miss Sally is going to take this information back to the community, you know, and give it to people. So yeah, that's how a lot of that was found out. And that, I heard that not only in that case, but several other cases where black domestics were people who gave people information. But the funniest story I heard about a black domestic was in Atlanta. The guy who led the sit-in movement in Atlanta was a guy by the name of Lonnie King. He was a Morehouse student at that time, and his mother was a domestic. And Lonnie King was on television leading the sit-in movement, right? And his mother was watching TV with the privileged white woman she worked for, right? And the lady looks at the TV and she looks at King's mama. She looks at the TV, she looks at King's mama. She said, "Do you know that young man?" She said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And that's another thing about black culture. In black folklore, there are a couple of different archetypes. One is the bad man. That's somebody who talks bad, who talks tough, that type of thing. Another archetype is the trickster. Is deception. You don't tell everything. You understand what I'm saying? Last night I talked about Medgar Evers, because Medgar Evers actually was portrayed as somebody who was nonviolent, but he carried guns. He had guns all around his house. At one time, he advocated having a black Mau. His wife said that he was arming himself and preparing for the eventuality of a race war, but he portrayed himself as nonviolent. And I think Medgar Evers, I'm not saying he's a liar, I'm just saying he was a trickster in a certain way. His brother Charles is different, though. He's a bad man. He talked tough. The title of my book, We Will Shoot It Back, that comes from Charles Evers, speaking in Nashville, Tennessee. He's more of the bad man. He talks tough and gives you that, bad man image. Bad, they would say today in hip hop, bad boy, right? Thug life or something. But he gives that type of image, right? Whereas Medgar was more that hopefully through the constitutional means we could work this out. That's what he said publicly. But, you know, he was preparing for something else if it went down. But that's two really kind of masculine archetypes that occur in through black culture that were you can see employed in how people operated in the movement. Another question or thoughts about what I'm saying? Do you think this is just ultimately crazy, or go ahead?
So the way that historians characterize nonviolent movements, it's more in an international civil rights context, that the nonviolent tactics sort of combine a lot of oppressed people into one kind of ethic. Could we say the same about armed resistance?
Well, armed resistance is actually an older tradition. Because think about it, nonviolence, well, people been using arms to fight since the beginning of human history, damn near, right? When humans had conflict. Unfortunately, even up to today, if you think about this whole thing with Syria, Barack Obama did what? Well, you said oppress people though, but Barack Obama, you know, he used the threat of violence to at least get this negotiation they just had with the Russians. So it's old as human history, but even with oppressed people, those of you who are Christians, David and Goliath, right? You know, using a slingshot to hit a guy upside the head, that's not too nonviolent, is it? That's not nonviolent. So, but it's old. It's old, you know, goes far back. And even in looking at African Americans, you know, people of African descent in the United States, you know, you have the slave revolts, right? You have Harriet Tubman, who carried a gun, you know. You have even black involvement in the Civil War. And y'all know that Lincoln credited two things to end in the Civil War: the emancipation policy and black involvement in the military. When he says emancipation policy, you know that after the United States had emancipation policy, that's just kind of to the side. You have blacks escaping from one side to the other. Du Bois calls it the Great General Strike that disrupts the Confederate economy. That's another whole nother point. But so it's attached. Nonviolence, you had people advocating nonviolence, but it first was applied to blacks in 1941 when the Congress of Racial Equality did sit-ins in Chicago. And then King in the Montgomery bus boycott advocated nonviolence, but it wasn't the same type of direct action that you experienced in 1960 when you had the sit-in movements. And it is attached, even at that period of time, it's attached to, as it developed, to the Gandhian ethic. What is it, Satyagraha? The principle that Gandhi talked about in terms of nonviolence as a weapon for oppressed people. So, and it's been employed different places, but particularly its emergence in the latter part of the I'm going to self-defense now, but it's particularly its emergence in the latter part of the 1960s was sometimes associated with national liberation movements that were using armed struggle in other countries. Here's the distinction I make. To me, armed resistance is a broad category. You have different types. One is self-defense. Like if somebody comes in here and threatens our group right now, we have a right to protect ourselves from harm and injury, right? That's self-defense. You also have another form of armed resistance that was used in, say like in Cuba when the Cubans, when Fidel Castro and they took power, or in Vietnam when they were, the Vietnamese were fighting to get control of their country from the French and later from the Americans. But they used guerrilla warfare as a part of what they call armed struggle to seize power. That's another form of, I would say, armed resistance. Some is retaliatory violence, and that's when retaliatory is different from self-defense. In other words, self-defense, we're protecting ourselves from somebody coming in here. But retaliation is different. If somebody comes and attack us, and then we say, I'm gonna get them fools back. So we go find out where we live and we attack them. That's retaliation. That's not self-defense. There's been no more threat of violence. That did occur. Y'all know what Tylertown is? Yes. Oh, I'm gonna tell y'all a gross story out of Tylertown. I was told, y'all heard of MacArthur Cotton? Matt Cotton, he lives in a Tyler County. He joined SNCC. He left Tougaloo College and joined Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He said that one place they knew they could go for protection, because, and I got this from him too, SNCC people had stuff, places in the state they call haven communities. These are places they could go. They know that the community was pretty much together. That they were very well organized, and they knew that they didn't have to fear a lot of reprisals when they were in that community. You understand that? So one place was like Harmony, Mississippi, another which is in Lee County, Mileston and Holmes County. These were all haven communities, but one was Tylertown, and it was because apparently back during that time, it was this place called, is it Bear Creek? I can't remember. I have to look in my text. There's a bridge that separated the white and black community. And if night riders came to the black community to attack it, they had to come over that bridge. And one time, they said, look, black community said they had enough. It wasn't going to go down like that anymore. If you do something, like Bernie Mac said, it's going to be consequences and repercussions. Well, the night riders came and they caught one of the guys, and they severed his head from his body and put it on the bridge. After that, you had no more night riders coming over that bridge anymore. I'm not saying the Klan just packed up and went home, but they wouldn't come into the black community anymore. So that's what I call retaliatory violence. After you capture somebody, they're not a threat to you anymore, right? I'm not saying they're wrong or right. I'm just saying that's what happened. And so that's another form of armed resistance. Another form that I think some people have challenged me on this, but I also argued, and we talked about this last night, is when people had boycotts. I used to think that people who were doing boycotts of the black community just would 100% say, we black, we're going to support this. But they had to give some people incentives to support a boycott. And how were boycotts organized? In that time, in the 60s, particularly after 1965, the first boycott that was kind of organized, how I'm describing, was in Natchez, Mississippi in 65. And what they would do was they would gather to announce to the black community they were having a rally at a church, right? A mass meeting. And they would get, some of the leaders of the community together, and they would present demands to the community saying that they wanted, blacks working in public service jobs. They wanted blacks, working in downtown, because a lot of times blacks, except for if you were cleaning up or you're cooking, you couldn't work behind a cash register or anything of that downtown. They wanted blacks to work for the police department, the fire department, things like that. These demands were almost universal in every community that you had boycotts in this period. But they also had the demand that elders wouldn't be referred to as boy, girl, auntie, uncle, but they would be referred to as Mr., Miss, Sir, Ma'am, the common courtesy that most elders expected at that time. So they would present those demands to the community. And they would say, who agrees with these demands? If you agree, stand up. Everybody stand up, because nobody really disagreed with that. And then they would say, okay, who's willing to boycott? We're not going to go downtown until we get these demands met by the white power structure. and almost 100% people stand up. And you have to think about it in this context. If your grandmama's standing up, you're pretty much gonna stand up. Particularly at that time, we had respect for our elders. So grandmama standing up, I know we're crazy now, but we had pretty much had respect for our elders during that period of time. And we would stand up. Say, you're trying to talk to this girl, she stand up, you're pretty much gonna stand up too. You know what I mean? If your preacher's in the audience, standing at the platform, he can see everybody out there. That time you're gonna stand up. You got respect for your preacher, right? You're gonna stand up. So they would get 100% of people to stand up. Then after that, they would have people monitor downtown to see who broke the boycott. And if you broke the boycott, again, like Bernie Mac said, there's gonna be consequences and repercussions. Originally they would just get you right there, downtown. And they wouldn't get an old man like me to do it because, if I see an old lady coming out of the store, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna give her a pass. I ain't got heart for anything like that. They would get, y'all heard of thugs? That would be the job for the thugs. They had a role for the thugs in the movement during those days. And they would get those guys, and they would be the people who would go after. They would take the merchandise from people. Sometimes they might administer corporal punishment. Y'all heard of that? Corporal punishment. In Belzoni, y'all were in Belzoni yesterday, right? If a young black female teenager broke it, they would have a team of young black female teenagers to get her. So it got to that type of level. People have always used coercion in boycotts, even in Jackson prior to this occurring. Any of y'all AMEs in here? AMEs? The last, not current, but the last bishop of the AME church for this region, Carolyn Tyler Guidry, she used to work for the NAACP back during the 60s, early 60s. And she told me that if somebody broke the boycott, the women would call you all night, keep your phone, keep you up. They would do the same thing for infidelity. If you were cheating or something, they would do that same thing before the reality show Cheaters. Black folks had a way of dealing with that. But so they use coercive means to pressure these people. I consider that a form of resistance in a way too. Why do I argue it's resistance? Because particularly when it's involved in politics, they had to challenge the authority of the segregationists and people's loyalty to the segregationists. And then they had to create loyalty for the Black freedom movement, right? So this was a means they used to create that loyalty. So I say it's resistance. And in every, say like in South Africa, you saw people having accountability groups and forces squads. In South Africa, it got extreme. And then in the struggle in Palestine, you see that also. You see it around the world, people having accountability. George Washington and them had accountability things to make people loyal to them, because y'all know that a large percentage of people were still loyal to the British, right? And so again, that's just something that goes as a part of these struggles. How do you create accountability? And so a lot of people use coercive means to do that. So I include all of that under armed resistance. I know I talked a long time, but yes, sir.
What lessons can, activists now who are still in the freedom struggle take from these people who you speak of? I think the narrative of civil rights kind of has been hijacked in a way that we get one narrative, and that's, I've never heard about the nonviolence until I read Negroes with Guns last year. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that there was violent resistance to what happened. Mm-hmm. So what can activists now who are still working on issues, I know like the ring defenders in Florida, mm-hmm. what can they learn from the lessons that we can learn from them?
To me, the major lesson, and a lot of people are surprised when I say this, I feel like whether it was new nonviolent direct action or armed resistance, the major thing, the deficit from that time to today is connectedness in a community. But you can't sustain a certain type of resistance unless you have strong networks, institutions, and relationships in communities. And so, for instance, the scenario I gave you about the boycott, that only works if people feel a relationship to one another. They'll be like, man, I don't care what they think. You know what I mean? And some of that existed then too. But if you have a lot of cohesiveness in a community, then you can sustain a resistance for a longer period of time. Today it's a lot more individualism. And so, and I actually learned this from Macomb, believe it or not. I didn't really understand it, start doing interviews in Macomb. There was an elder, and she asked me not to use her name. She's probably deceased now. And I need to come back to your community and follow up on the people that I interviewed. But she told me that her father taught her how to shoot, and she had a bunch of sisters. They were taught how to shoot because their father was concerned about white rapists. And there's another book, At the Dark End of the Street. If you haven't read that, you should read that book. It talks about how Rosa Parks, and in the new biography by Jean Theo Harris on Rosa Parks, talked about this. The Rosa Parks actually got active in the movement, fighting against cases of black women being raped by white men that at that point in time were just not enforced, right? And how the importance of that struggle of black women against just being indiscriminately attacked and sexually assaulted was another motivator for the movement. But going back, this woman told me that's how she learned how to shoot. And then more and more I saw that people were taught how to shoot by their parents for hunting, but also for protection. Today, like, how are young people getting guns? Off the street, right? Oftentimes associated to underground economy. I told you I grew up where? Compton. I lived in Compton when the Crips and Bloods started. I know I look old, and I am old, but Crips and Bloods started when I was in high school. Those people, folks weren't getting guns. I remember not being able to go to a party my senior year because there was so many people getting shot at parties. So many people getting their leather coats taken, things like that. Where were the guns coming from in those cases? From the underground economy through criminality, things of that nature. So it's a different thing that's going on right now that I think to be able to sustain and win, you're going to have to start building network and community. And things like traditionally in our community, like respect for elders. And y'all saying, well, he's old now, that's why he's saying that. No, but respect for elders, to have sharing is more important than, what do you call it? Like 50 Cent, came out with the song in the movie, Get Rich or Die Trying. Before it was get free or die trying. You know what I mean? So Martin King talked about it has to be a revolution in values. I think there are values in our community that have to be rebuilt again. I used to talk about years ago, and this before the hip hop of their generation. Some of y'all old enough to remember Goody Mob. I know they just came out with some again, but CeeLo, I remember, had this song on there, and he talked about how he had a scenario where somebody was trying to jack his car, and he said he'd rather they take the car than take that person's life, And but that's a old. Y'all probably heard of CeeLo, Gnarls Barkley or something, right? But he used to rap with a group called Goody Mob, one of Atlanta's greatest groups, but it was the most slept on group in history. It was slept on. It was slept on group. But those are values, to a lot of us today, material things are more important than relationships and people. And so you won't be able to sustain a movement. To me, guns are just technology. You know, well, what's the technology today if you're going to resist? A lot of times people are taking pictures, using all type of things to document things, to expose what police are doing, because that's still a problem. Trayvon Martin is not an exception. In 2012, you can look this up. There's a study called Operation Ghetto Storm. First it was called every 36 hours, but now we found it's every 28 hours. I'll tell you what's the difference. But in 2012, it was a study. Now, first it was done from January to June of 2012. And we found that I think it was like 120 deaths of blacks in the United States by police, security guards, or vigilantes. 120, and that was every 36 hours for that period of time. But when they did the total year, at the end of the year, it came out to be 313 killings of blacks. And that was one for every 28 hours. Many of the cases, I think about 47% people were unarmed. They didn't have weapons, and they were killed. And in majority, high percentage of the case, I don't know, I can't remember if it's a majority or not. The people who shot him said they shot him because they felt threatened. You heard about the young man that was just shot in Charlotte, North Carolina, right? He was unarmed. He was an athlete. I think he played football. He had a car accident and he was disoriented. He went to someone's house, knocked on the door. It was 2:30 in the morning. They felt threatened. And I would too, 2:30 in the morning, you knock on my door. And I know who you are. But then they called the police, and the police tasered him and then shot him.
12 times.
12 times, multiple times. Again, he felt what? Threatened. He felt threatened. And so this is still an issue. And I think black life is still not valued as it should be in American society, particularly black males, but black life is not valued. So it's still an issue. I mean, shoot, if the president of the United States is saying he could have been Trayvon, that shows it's a problem. If the president think if he was 30 years younger and just on the street, he could be, he could be a threat to lose his life, then it's an issue. But also, if you have an African-American president and you're still not safe, it's an issue. You feel me? One of my former students is now a social worker, and she told me, well, what does she tell young people today? You know what I tell them? Get organized. Just like in those days, the cavalry is not coming. You have an African-American president, and it didn't save Trayvon Martin. We got to save ourselves. And again, less people organize like people organized during that time in your communities, then it's no guarantee. That's no guarantee, but at least you got a fighting chance if you're organized, right? And you don't wait for an incident to happen. We had enough incidents already. It's time to get organized and start to build communities. It start to build trust where elders aren't fearing young people. You know what I mean? Right now, we also have what do you call it? Some people call it the school to prison pipeline, but now it's Marion Wright Element calls it the cradle to prison pipeline. And part of the elements that goes with that in our community is lack of trust. So even sometimes when people are innocent, or it might be a situation where someone doesn't have to go to jail, but it can be resolved through somebody repaying the debt of the crime that they committed to the community and the people they perpetrated against. Because, they have those, what they call restorative justice programs now. We're sending people away. Now, this young man I knew from Atlanta, he told me he's in a private prison. What is that? Wasn't these plantations? Wasn't those private prisons? these plantations our ancestors worked on. So, y'all better stop me and ask me some questions because I'm gonna talk. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I kind of have like a two-part question. First, I wanted to know like if your name was that was always your name, because I didn't know if there was a meaning behind it. And also, you spoke of your father being from this area. Do you have any of the family members or any family members that are part of the civil rights movement? And how does it add to your own personal history to know that you've done so much research on the area where your father was from? Has that added to your life as a
Man. Yeah, well, you asked a bunch. It was not my original name. When I graduated from high school, I didn't join a frat. I joined something called the House of Umoja, where I got my last name from, and we all changed our names and got African names. It was a group. It's really not a lot written on it. Some of us are reconstructing their history now. But anyway, that's how I changed my name when I was 18. I always wanted to change it. I grew up in a generation where I saw Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay become Muhammad Ali, and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was like 13 or 14, so I wanted to change my name. And after reading that and being influenced by that book, and that's another Macomb connection. Macomb students went to New York and met Malcolm X in 1964. But anyway, so my family, I don't think was a movement family per se, but they were just a part of the black community during that time. But even in my family, there are those stories. Last night, if you were there, I told a story about my grandfather. What I found out, and this is what I'm thinking is going to be my next project, is as soon as my book came out and my older cousin got a hold of it, he called me, or he sent me, we're on Facebook together, he sent me some stories about my uncles on my mother's side of the family who in northern Louisiana had used guns to confront attacks on the family there. And then other people start emailing me, telling me all these stories. So my next project, my next long project, I do these little short ones too. I got 3 other publications coming out this year in journal articles, or journal articles in a book chapter. I want to start collecting black family stories of defiance and resistance during Jim Crow. My wife's family, there was one where my mother-in-law told me that my father-in-law was a minister, grew up in South Carolina, went to Howard University, became a preacher, and his first assignment was in the United Methodist Church in Roanoke, Virginia. And in that church, which was a 100% black church, you know, what Martin Luther King said, the most segregated hour is on Sunday at 11 o'clock, right? It changed a little bit, but that time it was really true. Okay, they had to reserve the first seat on the first row of the pew for any white man who decided to visit. Even if a white man didn't come, they had to keep that seat open for him. That was tradition at that church. So my father-in-law, coming up during that time, the civil rights movements are about to start and things like, he met people like Benjamin Mays and stuff like that when he was in school. And I don't know if you ever heard of Howard Thurman. They were influences on my father-in-law. So he said, he got on the radio and said, this Sunday at church, people will sit on a first come, first served basis. We won't reserve seats for anybody. If you come and you decide to sit there, you're gonna sit down. He started getting death threats. So he was thinking, man, Sunday, we're not having church. He came to church and there were black men out there with rifles. Said, no, Reverend, we're gonna have church this Sunday. You know, so there are stories like that I feel like one of the reasons I wrote this book is I think that people have twisted images of what black people, descendants of slaves, particularly from the South, what we are like. What I mean by that is, just to give you an example, and the school I teach at Georgia State University in Atlanta. It's a school of 32,000 students. We graduate more black students than any school in the United States of America. And it's no population, no ethnic populations, majority population, but recently blacks became the largest ethnic group at Georgia State. I think we're 40%. We're probably a little bit higher because some people, we have a category where people aren't designating. We have a multiracial category. We have a category where people aren't designating. You know, a lot of our folks saying, I'm just an American. So we probably 42, 43%, but I don't know. Anyway, at our school, sometimes we've had tensions between the quote unquote African American community and the African Caribbean community and the people born on the African continent. So we've had these dialogues and discussions. And I don't know if we had one while you were there, but we had these dialogues and discussions. One time somebody from the Caribbean got up and said, well, the difference between our people and African Americans is our people fought back. You all didn't fight back, you just took it. And African American students, they say, yeah, our ancestors took it. Because they don't know this history. You understand what I'm saying? They don't know that people fought back. So it gives them a warped image of who their ancestors were. And if you think your ancestors were a certain way, that's you, right? And so these things like black people never fought back. You can't depend on nobody. You know, if something happened to you, nobody's gonna help you. You know, all these things come up, and that affects your potential to do something today. Y'all feel me? And so I think it's an important thing to tell these stories so people will know that their people did stand up. Again, I thought it was interesting that, again, Condoleezza Rice, who Dave Chappelle traded away on the racial draft. But her daddy and Angela Davis's daddy both were in armed patrols when the thing went down in Birmingham. That kind of tripped me out. And it wasn't just them. It was a lot of people who got up ready to protect the community. Let me tell y'all this. In the 50th anniversary, since it was just this Sunday, there are a lot of elements of the story, including that haven't really been emphasized. Another emphasis in the story that, when these bombings occurred, that people were having what they call spontaneous uprisings, or what people call riots. They had one in Macomb too, after Miss Aileen Quinn, is that her name? After her restaurant, her house was bombed. People went berserk in Macomb, and that's why the President Johnson met with people from Macomb the next day, and that's why they caught the bombers weeks later. They weren't trying to find those bombers earlier, but after people exploded, that's what happened. But in Birmingham, that happened too. Or what was the nickname for Birmingham? Bombingham, because there were 50 bombings between 1945 and 1962. That's in 17 years. There were 50 bombings. And then after 63, it was just off the chain, right? And so there's correspondence between Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and other members of the Justice Department saying, look, we gotta make sure that Dr. King has a victory in Birmingham. Why? Because he just had a defeat in Albany, Georgia. The movement, the white power structure was able to outsmart the movement there, right? And keep it from having civil rights victory. But also because they thought, because how blacks were acting in Birmingham, that people would, if King didn't win a victory there, that people would start listening to Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and other black nationalist groups and people like Robert Williams and others. And so that, even though they weren't at the negotiating table, these more militant groups had an impact on that decision. And again, that just shows the complexity of black politics, that you had all these points of view, but they all impacted what we now call change. So we interpret it, sometimes we just give one one aspect of our movement credit for making change, but actually it was all this. And King was aware of that. That's why, have y'all read Letter from Birmingham Jail? And remember, Martin Luther King says in there, he's warning America, look, if a change don't happen, you got these other brothers out here, and they talking something different. He said, I stand at the middle. He said, on one hand, I got people who are not doing anything, who are complacent. On the other hand, I got these other people. So if change don't come, so King was shrewd in applying that. Malcolm X was key in applying that too, because when King was in jail in Selma, Malcolm X came to Selma, and he said, he told the media, he said, I'm not there to cause any problems. I think King was in jail during that time. But Malcolm said this, but if you don't give Martin Luther King what he wants, we have others out here who are willing to use any means necessary to get change. So they were kind of skillful in utilizing negotiation. You feel what I'm saying? And that was necessary, I think, to bring about the change that occurred during that time period. Did I answer your question? Okay. Anybody else? Let me see. We got to make sure it ain't getting close to checkout time.
Thank you.
When Pac say, wake up, baby, you ain't on vacation, it's checkout time. Huh? Well, I want to thank y'all, but first, before I leave, I want Macomb students, tell me what you're working on. Because I don't know. I want to find out. I think this is great when I heard something about it last night, but I want to hear it from your mouth.
Right now, we're researching and trying to get more information, talking about like freedom schools and stuff like that, so we can put together another documentary for our organization.
And you have a documentary already? Two. How come you send it to your brother in Georgia? You can. I want to see it. I want to use it in my classes, in my teaching. Okay. So what are the first two on?
The first one
is the Birmingham High School walkout. The second one is the voting rights struggle in Macomb.
So what's the name of the sister in Berglund walkout? Brenda Travis. I met her a couple of times. Yeah. So y'all interviewed her? Wow. Wow. So, I wish y'all would talk to Curtis and.
We have an interview that the local culture students did with him, but we didn't put it in the documentary, but we watched it. And
yeah. What about Joe Martin told me about that too. But he told me it tripped me out. Did y'all did an interview with him?
I think so.
He told me about how I think he had to go over to the white high school at that time and get the football uniforms. And he said that the white football team was practicing in the uniforms that the black team would get. So they got their old uniforms that they were practicing in. And to me, I would always tell that to kind of illustrate, the segregation wasn't separate but equal. And that, to me, that was a clear example of why not. So y'all see, I've been down there, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So, I want to get those documentaries.
I mean, I think you guys are being a little humble too, because the documentary last year won the National History Day competition.
Yeah. So we need to bring it to Atlanta. Yeah, I got to figure a way to get y'all to Atlanta, or at least a representative with your teacher to show it in Atlanta. Something. Yeah. We had a National Black Arts Festival, things like that. We went to
Washington, D.C. to show it at a museum where they're displaying it throughout the year. Like every time somebody goes over there, they can watch the documentary, our second documentary.
And that's on the voting rights struggle.
Yeah.
And so the next one is on
Freedom Schools.
Freedom Schools. Wow. That's good.
They did a summer institute this summer where they researched and learned how to research and read the books and the archives, where they're going to learn how to do the documentary and conduct it and take some stuff out to see what they want to put in and what they want to take out to enter in National History Day, but not just in National History Day, to show everybody and share,
And so what grades are y'all in school?
I'm a junior, 9th grade.
Freshman in college.
Where at?
Tougaloo.
Okay. Mighty Tougaloo.
I'm in 8th grade.
8th grade? Okay, so y'all being trained. Y'all youngsters are being trained by the OGs.
I'm in the 11th grade.
11th grade? Okay.
He's also part of the
Sophomore.
Oh, you sophomore? Very good. So y'all, man, that's great. So and you must have been a part of the starting group.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm glad that you're still connected in it.
You guys got a film? Oh.
So you know you got to get, if the triple OG, I said I'm an OG, if the triple OG don't know about it, then y'all need to,
Yeah.
y'all need, we need to get it up here or something, or invite her to where you're showing it. But that's real good.
Is the House of Umoja still operating?
No. What we did was we joined other groups. So one of the groups we joined, the current formation is called Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. So Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. So if you heard of the new mayor of Jackson, Chokwe Lumumba, he was a part of our organization. He was a part of a group called the Republic of New Africa before. But we all joined together to try to carry on Malcolm X's theme or some of his major principles. And one of the reasons we formed it before most of your time, but some of y'all might remember when in the late 80s, early 90s, Malcolm X became popular again. Brothers were wearing hats with an X on it, stuff like that, and we were kind of concerned that that whole thinking might get too commercialized. So we wanted to create something that would try to maintain his memory and maintain the principles. And so in Atlanta, every year we have a Malcolm X festival that's very popular in Atlanta. Sometimes we think it's so popular that we didn't host it, people would still come. Current power structure.
Like, do you think that this government and this power structure will really ever say, you know what, yeah, let's treat everybody right and do everybody good?
In order to make change, you gotta be willing to stick your neck out and demand change. Nobody's gonna hand you nothing. I do, when I'm speaking somewhere, I have this little thing that I do with now who wants this $5?
It's gas money. Hamburger.
Let me tell you something. Everybody raised their hand, but you didn't get up to come get it. You gotta get up and get what you want.
You still didn't get up.
Get up. I can't hand it to you after I told you. See, you have to get up and get it if you want it. Nobody's gonna hand you anything, and you guys, it's your turn now to make a change. When I was 17 years old, 16, I was in a movement. It was with Amzie Moore when we were in Cleveland. I was younger than that because I remember when we used to go with Amzie to he was a quartet singer, and it would be 50 of us, I'm exaggerating, of course, pile up in his little car, and he didn't have no windshield in the back. And we were riding down these dusty roads, and all that dust would get on us. But we were dedicated. And you got to be dedicated, and you got to know how to organize and just make the change yourself. Nobody is going to hand you change. Like people tell me, Obama ain't did nothing for black people. What is he supposed to do? What president you know that ever did anything for black people? If you don't go up there and open your mouth and let people know what you want, then you're not going to get nothing, and you're doomed to repeat the past, which is happening now with the Voter Rights Act and the voter ID laws. See, those Tea Party people and Republicans are some sore losers. And the reason why we were getting killed back in the 60s because we decided to make a change. And they knew that this day would come when we would have an African-American male president. I tell you why I call Mr. Obama a map, because his daddy was black, but he was raised by white people, his grandparents. And map miscegenation. You know what miscegenation is? Mm-hmm. I call him a miscegenated American person, and that's why I call him a map.
I gotta steal that.
You can have it. But you gotta make a change yourself. Just intellectualizing and talking about what we're gonna do and Facebooking people and tweeting people. When it gets down to it, you gotta organize and march and agitate and make demands. These white people in Cleveland still call me an agitator. That was 50 years ago when we had the brand agitator put on us. Mm-hmm. But you gotta get out and agitate and march and get with all of the people. It's like you down in Macomb, I'm up here in Cleveland, you up there in Oxford. We gotta come to a certain point where we can all get together and demand and go to DC or wherever we have to go and demand what you want. Because you're not going to get nothing just by talking about it.
I'd add to that. I quote W.B. Du Bois, who said, "The system that enslaves you cannot free you. The system that enslaves you cannot free you." And sometimes I compare our reality today to the Matrix. If you remember in the movie, y'all saw the movie The Matrix. In the Matrix, everybody thought that they were free, but they were connected to the Matrix that was sucking the life out of them, right? If we think about it today, like the United States is going through this financial crisis, and many of our neighbors, friends, relatives have lost their homes. And at the same time, the banks are experiencing record profits. What is that telling us? You know, even with the African-American president.
A map.
A map. Thank you, the map. So, and I just told you about the numbers of blacks that are killed by police, security guards, and vigilantes. It's not declined now, right? It's people like George Zimmerman, or it's like this cop in Charlotte. Because of the struggle, though, we do have a better chance of at least getting a day in court sometime. But if you think about it, if it wasn't for a movement, Trayvon would have never went to court. His family would have never got a day in court. There had to be a major mobilization, right? Because that just been thought about. That would have just been forgotten about. We had a case in Atlanta in a place called Union City. This is in Metro Atlanta, where a 19-year-old was shot twice in the back by a police officer, and we couldn't get the Fulton County Court to indict the police officer. Kid shot twice in the back. You know, he was running away from a scene. He didn't have a weapon on him. Shot twice in the back. But we couldn't even get the Fulton County prosecutor, who's an African American, we couldn't even get him to bring the case to court to try the police officer in that particular case. So our lives are still not valued and respected in this society. And ultimately, there needs to be some sort of more fundamental change. I think we have to fight for incremental change right now, because I believe last night when I talked, I told people how in Mississippi, in period of time from Reconstruction all the way up to the 1950s, you didn't see a lot of confrontational fight for change. But I said that during that time that black people built communities, they built churches, they built their families, they built lodges, they built businesses. Margaret just told you when she was working with Amzie Moore, you were traveling to a singing group, which was an institution. The significance of that is they were able to go register people to vote and organize people through the singing group, but they had to have some sort of network to be able to operate under. So I think for us to be able to make the type of fundamental change we need, we have to be organized on a more massive level. We have to have more cohesive community in order to bring that about. And I think we have to look for new paradigms too, even when we're right now. I mentioned that Chokwe Lumumba was a part of the organization I'm a part of. And one of the things that was different about first his campaign for city council is in that community, they formed something called a People's Assembly, and the People's Assembly is what came up with his platform. And when he was elected to city council, they didn't get rid of it. He still got direction from people organized in his community. And it was also a form of accountability for him. Because he couldn't say after that point, okay, y'all help me get elected, okay, later for y'all. But they were giving him direction on how he should vote, what he should speak on. And then those people who were in part of the People's Assembly, they began to organize around things in the community themselves. So then he ran for mayor. The hope is that they're going to expand that citywide. But that'll be a new form of black politics, we hope, and of politics in America, where we have another level where this comes from the grassroots that actually makes candidates more accountable. And that's just something we need to do interim till we form a different type of system where y'all ever watch Michael Moore's movies? One of the ones, Sicko, to me is like how most industrialized countries around the world, this debate we just had over healthcare, they don't have it. I mean, your healthcare is taken care of. You know, many countries around the world, based upon merit, you don't have to worry about paying to go to college. But now you could be a brilliant person, but if you don't get the financial support, you're not going. And the alternative might be for some. You know, I met some of the most brilliant students I've ever had is when I taught in prison. I've taught in prisons in Florida and in Georgia, and some of the most brilliant students I have were prisoners. I took my Georgia State students in there, and they couldn't compare to them. And Georgia State students are good, but they couldn't compare to these brothers in prison. Of course, they had more time to read, but they came in thinking they were going to teach these men, and they said, "We already read that, but if you read this, and this." You know, so they're brilliant. There's some brilliant minds out there, and potential that we have out there that are not being utilized for the betterment of everybody. And instead, you know, that it costs more to keep somebody in prison than it is to educate somebody. But you know, again, the values of this society. I don't mean to sound like doom and gloom, but you know. But I do think we can produce something better, and I believe y'all, as I grew with Margaret, you all can do something better. And we're still in the mix with you. We ain't going nowhere. We ain't in retirement. Yeah, we're still in the mix.
So do you agree there was not as much internal struggle then? There was more sense of a community? Because like in our community, the students have been learning about how one of the major streets in the black community used to be a up-and-coming place. You know, the black people didn't have a reason to really go outside of their community because they formed one themselves. And so we interviewed a guy that was saying he was younger during the time, and he didn't even know what was going on because they had movies, they had you know, all this going on. And so, but now that street is polluted with drugs and abandoned buildings, and you know, so, but no one, you know, everyone talks about it or, you know, looks at it or either doesn't do anything about it at all because of either greed or the power struggles that exist keep us from, developing that sense of community, like places like Chicago where you have more black men killing each other.
Right.
How do you,
I agree with you. I think I'm not saying integration was bad, but it's maybe how we did it. I mentioned Queen Mother Moore. She told me one of the mistakes she made was she was a part of a campaign to force Major League Baseball to integrate. And before you had, black people were banned from Major League Baseball, but we established our Negro Leagues. And Negro Leagues, my father used to tell me, if the Kansas City, what were they, Royals came to your town, people want to come see them. So people were staying in black-owned hotels, going to black restaurants. There were people vending at the baseball games, all that. Queen Mother Moore said that when they integrated and started taking away the better black players, that ended the league. And she said rather than integrating individuals, they should have integrated teams. Which could have took that economic base and connected it and made them stronger and kept it in. And so some of the times, I think we confuse integration for assimilation. And I always tell people, I don't think Martin Luther King was an assimilationist. I think he was an integrationist. That he wanted black people to have access to stuff like Georgia State. Prior to 1964, there weren't any blacks at Georgia State. Something they fought for. Now, blacks, now it graduates more blacks than anybody in the United States. But, so that, he was fighting for that, but I don't think he would have wanted, like, Morehouse not to exist anymore. I think he would still thought Morehouse was important. I think he would have still thought the black church was important. So I think we have to figure that out. How do we be a part of this and then have a sense of community, economic development in our communities, sense of self-love, but not, when I say different from assimilation is us desiring to be something be more like dominant mainstream society. You know what I mean? So there were institutions, things we created that were valuable, and maintain that respect for elders, maintain that looking out for children, maintain, you know what I mean? And so I think some of that was that was important, and I think it got confused and disrupted. And then I think there are economic forces that occur too, like, and we live in a capitalist society, and it's a society where big fish eats little fish. So when Walmart comes in your community, what happens to the smaller stores? When so some of those things I think we have to figure out.
Yeah, Martin Luther King also said when at the end he had recognized what we were losing by integrating, and he said integration is like running into a burning building.
That's right.
He knew we were being destroyed, our communities were, because I grew up in Cleveland. I used to think that Cleveland was, where it was nice. We had theaters, the stores, and I didn't even come in contact with nobody but the one white person that my mom worked for. I was so bad. I even thought that white people had a different Jesus and a different God than black people. I never could understand how they got this, we can worship the same God, but they were so nasty. I was aware of that, like when I was 8 years old, that, these white people, I don't want to go to their church because they don't know nothing. And besides, we had spirituals, a spirit in our church. That's when the church people were involved with the community, involved with the children. We had all kinds of activities to keep us busy. But when we came up, as the people say, we lost that sense of community. I remember if my mama was gone and I was just on the other side of town or somewhere, and somebody saw me doing something. They could get me and discipline me. We don't have that sense anymore, where you can get, just correct children now, because the parents will come and try to kill you about their child when their child is wrong. So we lost all of that. Like I call it, the personal pronoun generation. You don't have a sense of each other's well-being. It's all about me and my and I and what I'm gonna get and what I've done. And when essentially you're all just a little speck on this earth like everybody else.
But I think what can be done is development what we call intentional community on a smaller basis. You build up to that.
Yeah.
And so you could do that through your churches. You could do it through what do you call it? Rites of passage programs in our community. And I often tell people we not only need rites of passage for somebody going from puberty to adulthood, we need it for people my age or young elders becoming older elders. So I need, so I think we need just that interconnectedness again. And again, we can do that intentionally, knowing that we need it and start associating with people with like values. And it becomes so powerful. Other people want to, they need that. They need that stability in their lives. So. Yes.
How would you see transferring those ideals into the educational system?
She said, how do we transform that into the educational system? Actually, I believe in a multi-pronged strategy. My wife, actually 9 years ago, she established a school. It only had 60 students. She was a public school teacher. She's was a master teacher in Atlanta public schools, training other teachers. Now she's a consultant for schools across the United States. I mean, she has she doesn't have any in Mississippi, but she has a contract in North Dakota, South Central LA, South Georgia, Minnesota, Boston, Maine, and Washington D.C. She travels more than I do. But 9 years ago, she established a school, culturally relevant curriculum, with also social justice curriculum. It has 60 students in Atlanta. K through 8. We graduated our first 2 students last year from the 8th grade. But that's a model, and that's a way you can form intentional community, because the parents have to be educated and the parents develop relationships and things of that nature too. But at the same time, I think the majority of our students don't get to go to schools like that, right? And so we have to have a battle, and it's really a political fight to control the curriculum of our schools and things of that nature. It's something that, in Georgia, it's determined by the state government what your state standards are. Now, I've worked with teachers to look at the state standards and see how can we apply these state standards to our community. But actually, we're going to have to fight to control school systems. We're going to have to fight that's a part of the battle. In fact, it's interesting to me how many former SNCC people are now engaged in the fight around education, like Bob Moses and others. They're saying that that's the major fight.
Yeah, it is.
At this human rights fight at this time is it can determine whether you go to Harvard or you go to prison. So but we're gonna have to fight to control the school systems and fight on a state level to control input the curriculum. It's interesting to me also that people fought to get the civil rights movement included in Mississippi history in terms of what's taught in the schools, but it's not really implemented.
It's not being taught.
So it's going to have to be a push to on the grassroots level to make sure our schools are doing it. And you have progressive teachers that need to link with community people and progressive policymakers too to make sure this is implemented. I think that's why I think this is important to have these these students and people who are engaged in trying to reconstruct the history here in one place. I know you had people here last night from the new Civil Rights Museum. So hopefully we can impact that in terms of how the story is interpreted, but then how it's used to be really used for social change. And I mean, a lot of times when we have these civil rights museums and things, they're there for tourism, which is important for the local economy. I'm not going to sleep on that, but then we should also use it in terms of creating further change for future generations. So that's something. So particularly you all who are in higher education now and you're planning to be educators, I think that's an important thing to think about the political dimensions of that.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we should get on the road. Okay?
It means so much to me to hear both of you talk about the intersection of women's rights and civil rights and LGBTQ rights and civil rights and class problems and civil rights. And I was wondering, so recognizing the importance of how these movements are connected and how these systems of oppression are holding all of us down, if you have any advice for someone trying to be an ally to a group that they're not necessarily like a white person, myself, as an ally for the civil rights movement.
During the 60s, we didn't make a distinction between women's rights, anybody's rights. It was all about human rights, which it still is with me today. Like I explained to people, women have right. Everybody, you're supposed to not just say, oh, we women, so we need to do this. You need to join the human race, for the fight for human rights. I'm a big proponent of everybody's rights. I'm working with Friends of Justice now for juvenile justice and stop all this mass incarceration. I know there's women that have not joined that. I don't know one woman from a woman's right group that joined that, mostly because the ones we're trying to save are Black and Hispanic young men. I used to work with UNESCO, and we decided that we were going to, I'm so sorry they just got disfunded, but anyway, we decided that we were going to start working with 6th grade boys, totally Black and Hispanic 6th grade, because that's the trouble starts when they're in the 6th grade. And then Nan went back and decided that maybe we need to go to the 3rd grade and teach them. And in the 6th grade, we were teaching these kids about critical thinking. You don't have to wait till you go to college and take a critical thinking class. And anybody that's going to be an educator, like Falana is an educator, we need to just start paying more attention to these Black young men because they've been traumatized. They got enough issues, I don't know, for any whatever reason. So it's not all about just women's rights, because I know I made a lot of people mad with me down there at UF. But you speak the truth. I speak the truth because I like everybody to be free. Yeah. Women had rights. White women had rights. Black women didn't have no rights because white women, they lost the vote when Jim Crow came into being. Black men could vote, but Black women couldn't. White women started the suffragette movement, and when they got the right to vote, they forgot about us. They did not even think about trying to get rights for all women, all people. It was just all about the white women. They had the right to go to any university that they want to go to. When I got out of high school, I couldn't go to a university in Mississippi for the simple reason that I couldn't go to Delta State or Ole Miss or wherever because they were segregated. I couldn't go to the hysterically Black colleges and universities because they were kicking everybody like we were talking about Southern. My brother Sam got kicked off campus over at Mississippi Valley State.
Exactly.
So we were identified as troublemakers. So we were in between a rock and a hard place. The only way I went to school is I had to go all the way to California because I was not going to beg down and shut up. Sam was on campus over at Mississippi Valley State trying to organize a chapter of SNCC on campus. What better place to organize SNCC students than on a college campus? So that's what I was saying, that the women liberals should have joined our movement and fought and advocated for everybody. It's not just, you can't be like, I'm in SNCC and you over there in whatever's, you know, we need to come together because like Jesse Jackson, I'm not a big fan of his, but he formed the Rainbow Coalition. Gay people, black people, everybody. And then during the Civil Rights Movement, we had a lot of, it was an integrated movement. We had, white people, black, everybody came. And then after that, I was in SNCC. First, I worked with SCLC as a freedom school, a citizenship school teacher. Then I joined SNCC when Diane Nash came to Cleveland. But then there was Aaron Henry up in Clarksdale. He was in the NAACP. And, it was just a lot of different civil rights organizations, but we were doing the same thing, but we were not cohesive. So that's when we formed COFO. All of us got together. All of y'all know about COFO, don't you? That's why we formed COFO. That was at the suggestion of Aaron Henry. And y'all will see his house tomorrow when we go to Clarksdale. Yeah, we formed COFO, and that was the Congress of Freedom Organizations. And all of us got together and, just sneaking everybody. We still had our same identity, but we knew we were under one umbrella working for the same change and the same goal. So then out of that, we formed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We were bad, weren't we? Yeah, but what I'm saying, I said that to say that everybody's got to come together. Time, it's critical now. It's more critical than it was now because Mr. James Crow is more dangerous than Jim Crow. James Crow sitting up there with that thing on the bench saying life. Like just willy-nilly sending young black and Hispanic men to jail. Then we got the police is shooting people and getting away with it. We got the George Zimmerman, so times are very dangerous now. You don't have just one identifiable hate group now, like the Klan. Before, we had 2 identifiable hate groups. Well, 3 with the FBI. But we had the Klan, and they were the poor whites that was taking directions from the White Citizens Council.
Exactly.
And the White Citizen Council was the farmers and the bankers and all of that. Like today, they don't call themselves that, but we know what they are. They don't have to explain it to you. So y'all in a more critical stage than we were in. They trying to, education. I am so mad about what they doing with these schools, and that No Child Left Behind ain't nothing but a crock of crap. It's just so frustrating too to see all of the changes that we made, and then people are just giving them back. You're not standing up. You're not saying nothing about nothing but who going to bouncing in the club all night or talking about Lil Wayne or something really insignificant. I even look at Tavis Smiley and see how they reduced him to just insignificant commentator. That's what I call him now, an insignificant commentator. Because who cares about whoever he has on his show? He had somebody on the other night. Don't nobody care about Beyonce and Jay-Z. I don't care about Beyonce, and I don't like phony no-how. She's just as phony as a $3 bill. But why why Chavez putting Obama down, he ain't doing no more than Obama by doing all of this stuff. He could do better than that. He doesn't talk about like this, state prepares first run for voter ID law. He's not talking about that. He's not addressing anything. And then y'all, that's why I'm telling y'all better stand up and figure it out and fight like we did.
I would add to that the example Margaret used in terms of COFO being an umbrella. When you find any movement at its strongest is when it has unity and it has strong alliances. To me, one of the best examples is Montgomery bus boycott. You had the Women for Political Change, you had the NAACP, the sleeping car porters, the variety of churches, and they formed one umbrella, Montgomery Improvement Association. And then they had alliances with people and coalitions with people all across the United States to support that local movement to bring about change. Historically, we just have to remember the difference between an alliance and a coalition. Coalitions are temporary. Alliances are people you have long-standing value agreements on. So there are some white people I've worked with since the 60s. The 60s, what am I talking about? Since the 70s. Because I was 60s, in 69 I was 15. So, but since the 70s, I've had long-standing relationships. I worked with them around Haiti. I worked with them around political prisoners, other issues. And so, but we have common values, right? And they, at the same time, I can maintain my identity and they can maintain theirs. You feel me? So there's a mutual respect there. So I think we need to build unity on those type of basis. And what Margaret talked about too, that respects human rights for everybody. And so if there are Black people in my community who said don't respect queer rights, I have to, I got a challenge. And one of the articles I mentioned, I'm working on some articles now. One of the articles I'm working on is of a man who was a Black Panther, Coercive Means, but he was also queer and he was an anarchist. And I talked about how he's marginalized in history, but because of his sexuality, similar to Byron Rustin, because of his sexuality, but also he was an anarchist. And so he's not talked about like some of his peers are. And I was thinking, you ever watch The Wire? The Wire is a TV show, and so you had this guy in there who's queer, Omar, but he was gay. He was one of the baddest, most macho guys you could think of. Coercive Means kind of fits in the same category. He was a political prisoner and escaped prison twice. And the first time he escaped, they caught him the second time because he was trying to help another former Black Panther escape. But his stories are legendary because he's queer and because he is an anarchist, which is kind of a minority political point of view in the Black community. You don't hear about him as much as you might hear about other people. And so, but again, I think just like Omar kind of challenged Black popular culture in a certain type of way, I feel Coercive Means story could too, to make people think, well, wow, these stereotypes I had about gay people, it's not, because in Black street culture, Black queer people are supposed to be soft, Black queer men supposed to be soft, they're not really, so there can't really be no soldier. So that challenges that thinking, in that. So I have a responsibility to kind of force people to think critically around that, even within my community, with my students. I have that responsibility, and I'm being a good ally when I do that. The same Margaret saying, people have to be a good ally to talk about our struggle in that way too. in our community. One example, I think, and I'll close with this. You ever heard of Florence Kennedy? There's I found out about her recently as a black woman by the name I'm getting Alzheimer's, can't remember her name. Is writing a biography on Florence Kennedy. She was she's a lawyer, was a lawyer in New York, who was a black nationalist and a feminist. And so when they started having Black Power conferences, she would make sure that they had sessions on women's liberation. But then she was also in the early development of National Organization of Women. She would go there and make sure they had sessions on Black Power. So she was creating this, attempting to create this dialogue across these two different movements. And so I think she's a good example of the connection we need to make between different movements that are fighting for social justice. That's we really need that. I agree with Margaret more than ever.
I know we got to head out. This is, I think, I've been thinking about this in terms of coalition building. Is that I think that in teaching undergraduates now, I think that for lots of people, they're social progressivist people, they're liberal people, but they reduce everything to class. So when you say that as a black person and you're a poor black person, I deal with issues that my race and my class both inhibit me from. Right. I think for a white person who is a liberal, but who is from middle class background or is from another oppressed group, but is not from a poor black, they see that, no, your issues are class based. So if we all just rally around class, everything will be fine. I think that by recognizing that, no, it's not just class, also a racial element of oppression that as a white person, you play a role in just by being white sometimes. And if you can recognize that, and then deal with that, and then use that as a strategy towards the coalition building and the allyship, that's a good way. I think that most people just say it's all about class, and that's why if we all just focus on class and not about race, we would all be okay. And race becomes divisive, and that's something that we can actually build coalitions with. So that's what
my elders in the movement, they used to call that reductionism. You try to reduce everything down to one thing. And I think when you have alliances and you're developing relationships, it's important to listen. I remember when I was in graduate school, I took a class on, my advisor, I wanted to take this other class, and he made me take this class on African-American women's fiction. And I said, man, I don't read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of history and politics. And he made me take this class, right? And so we were reading Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. I hadn't read those books, so I had to shut up and listen. And it was predominantly black women in that class. My wife thanks them today because I had to shut up and listen. Sometimes I think they forgot I was there. And I would hear, at first I got real defensive, because it was like, damn, they slamming black men and they're attacking, And then I said, wait a minute, why should I feel like that if, unless I'm guilty, And so it was just an opportunity for me to hear. And I just learned a whole lot. And I learned that even though I'm oppressed as a black male, the oppression for black women is different. Because even though black men are sexually assaulted, that's a whole different reality for black women that they have to think about, maybe every day. And I don't think about being sexually assaulted every day. I might think about it if I go to jail, but you know what I'm saying? So I had to learn. I couldn't collapse everything down to the same thing, but that's when the whole respect piece comes in. I sit down, I listen, and I learn from that experience. And then I could be a better ally if I do that. So that was a good point.
I think it really goes back to acknowledging your privilege. There's always going to be tension if you just refuse to see how your station in life is affecting your contribution to people. And I remember my friend who was in this feminist group in Tallahassee and was like,
can you come up forward, because I can't hear you as much back there.
I remember my friend who was trying to do coalition building between all the feminists in Tallahassee, and they're having a lot of problems between people of different races and just trying to come forward and get one thing pushed together. And they finally had this really, really big conversation where everyone, every different type of person acknowledged the privilege that they had. And after doing that, they're really able to like move forward and formalize this.
That's good.
Thank you, Kay.